evening, and we are delighted to have you all here today at this session organized by Chennai International Center. We have a very good set of panelists here and a very senior moderator with us. We'll begin the session shortly with a welcome address by Mr. Rahul Maman of the MRF Group. He's also the trustee of Chennai International Center. Over to you, Rahul.
Good evening, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to a very interesting discussion on the future of electric vehicles in India. There's lots of excitement about the EV segment in India, but there are also lots of questions like which segments will go electric first, what are the key drivers for adoption, and how can policy influence the pace? And in order for us to think through these issues, we have an outstanding group of panelists. First, we have Mr. Vellayan, one of the most dynamic business leaders in the country. He is the chairman of Cholamandalam Finance and the MD of Tube Investments of India. Tube Investments is a large auto component supplier to the automotive industry, and they're also looking at entering the EV space. So that gives them a very interesting perspective. Next, we have Mr. Tarun Mehta, the CEO and co-founder of Ether. Tarun and Ether have really set the benchmark in terms of technology in the electric two-wheeler space. They make some really cool products. He also has a strong connection with Chennai as he's an alumnus of IIT Chennai. Then we have Mr. Mahesh Babu, the CEO of Switch Mobility, the electric arm of Ashok Leyland. And before this, he was the MD of Mahindra Electric, and he's launched several electric vehicles. And I think we can call Mr. Mahesh Babu a veteran of the very young electric vehicle space. And finally, to moderate the discussion, we have Dr. Sumantran, who's an authority on the global automotive industry. He brings with him the experience of working with GM, Tata Motors, and Ashok Leyland. He's taught at MIT and IIT, and also been a member of the Science Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India. So we have a great set of panelists and an outstanding moderator, and I'm sure we'll have a very, very interesting discussion. I hand it over to you, Dr. Sumantran.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Anita. It's a pleasure to join this very stellar panel on a topic that I think is hogging the headlines practically every day. You don't even have to delve into trade journals or business papers. General purpose newspapers and magazines are full of stories every day about the kind of transformation that's happening in this industry and the excitement around electric vehicles. When there is any industry going through transformation or a technology going through transformation, there are perhaps possibilities of viewing the transformation through several lenses. One is the lens of the alacrity of change. I mean, for some in the industry, you would think that, oh my God, we've just leapfrogged BS5, we've gone from BS4 to BS6, we've done a whole lot of change, and we're already on to another transformation with electric vehicles. Things are moving way too fast and way too rapid for a large society to manage. But any technology revolution takes time. And for those in the industry for a long time, I can recall the time when I was part of the work team at GM's first electric vehicle, the EV1, which was launched in 1997. The first time a big OEM launched a pure purpose-built battery electric vehicle. So in a sense, one can say that's already 23 years ago. So since then, we've had the Toyota Prius. While it was not an electric vehicle, it was a hybrid. People started to learn how to manage motors, motor controllers, battery energy. So you could say that this revolution has really been maturing over time, which is true for all technological revolutions. As if one is familiar with the Gartner's hype cycle of innovation, by some lenses, innovation seemed rapid. But in reality, there's a lot of people who've been working a lot of time to slowly mature technology to when it's ready for public use. So in a sense, we could say today we are, without a doubt, passing an inflection curve where this adoption of EVs is no longer a matter of if, but a matter of how and when. And if we go back to Victor Hugo's statement, there's no power on earth that can stop an idea whose time has come. So it seems like now there's nothing holding back EVs. It's an idea whose time has come. Of course, a big motivator for EVs has been the environment. World leaders and many NGOs and society groups are all getting ready for COP26, which will happen in Glasgow very soon. Probably the most important meeting since the Paris Climate Accords. And there is a lot of hope that global society will emerge with greater conviction and greater commitment to climate change. We have seen even between Paris Climate Accord and COP26, all sorts of calamities around the world, massive forest fires in Australia and the US. We've seen floods, glaciers melting at a remarkable pace. So much evidence that climate change is something we can't ignore anymore. And as if to underscore that, this year, the Nobel Committee has chosen to award the physics prize to climate scientists. In fact, even today, Google has now said that they will, in their mobile apps, make sure that travelers, commuters will have an option of looking at the carbon footprint of their travel, all indicating that there is greater concern for the environment and the role of mobility and mobility's carbon footprint on the environment. Now, EVs to many people will be an answer. It's important to realize that EVs, yes, can be an answer, but there is an if, and there is an important if, which is this EV, the entire EV ecosystem will be a part of a larger energy ecosystem. And for those who delve deeper into the subject, you begin to realize that when you do what's called a proper well-to-wheel analysis, and by the way, recently the government of India has commissioned a very detailed study by academics, peer-reviewed with international scientists, about the actual current well-to-wheel analysis for a whole range of energy pathways. So that means gasoline vehicles, diesel hybrids, battery electric, and even hydrogen for that matter. And what you realize with this is that in the total system equation, the arbitrage is not very much. And so the conclusion is, yes, battery electric vehicles offer a lot of advantages. They have zero tailpipe emissions, no pollutants, and they have a potential for very dramatic carbon reduction. But it is very implicitly linked to the quality of the grid. So EV transformation in India, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, will closely be linked to the basket of energy sources that we use in our grid. The good news is in India, the roadmap for increasing the quantum of renewables in our energy grid is encouraging. We're making good progress. And every extra percentage of renewables that form a part of our electricity and energy grid starts to tilt the balance in favor of EVs. So there's a good reason to be optimistic. As they say, when you're planning for the future, don't shoot where you are, shoot ahead of the target. And in that sense, one can hope that by 2030 and beyond, the fraction of renewables will make the migration to EVs worthwhile. There's another aspect of EVs as well. They are the darling of investors. The last time I saw earlier this year, Tesla's valuation was at $780 billion. They also announced last week that for the first time in a quarter, they sold 250,000 vehicles, which means at this rate, they will end up selling 1 million vehicles in a year. But to set that in context, Toyota, which sells 10 times that number of vehicles at 10 million units, has a market valuation of $240 billion. So for selling 1/10 the vehicles that Toyota does, Tesla has a market cap of 3 times Toyota. So clearly, EVs are a darling for investors. I was an advisor to the owners of Rivian, the electric truck company, and they're about to do an IPO now, which is estimated to be listed at a valuation of $70 billion. And they've not sold a single commercial vehicle yet. So there's a lot of expectation and hope from investors that this is indeed the way for the future. But while there is a lot of interest and limelight that's hogged by the disruptors and the startups, the legacy players are not going to give up without a fight. For a while, there was a degree of hesitancy amongst the legacy players, but now we begin to see all of them come out with all sorts of announcements. Volkswagen having 28 different models and GM having 4 different platforms, committed to electrification of their entire fleet. And they begin to now leverage their supply chains, their capabilities. So Ford is now able to launch an F-150 Lightning at a price of $40,000, which is actually not very far off an affordable pickup truck in the US. So the legacy players are definitely going to come back. And so it will be an interesting dynamic in the marketplace between the new startups and disruptors and the legacy players. And I hope in the end, all that means is it's good for consumers, good for customers, and good for any vibrant economy. In India, the focus has primarily been on two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and buses. In some ways, people may feel that passenger cars have been slighted or ignored, but in a country where subsidies are important to nurture a nascent industry, and a country where using taxpayers' money to subsidize, let's say, a wealthy man's toy is perhaps not going to be acceptable. The focus on affordable two-wheelers and three-wheelers and the focus on mass transit is perhaps understandable. But I have no doubt over time, this interest will spread, and there will be a much broader spectrum of interest and support across the full spectrum of mobility solutions. A transformation of this nature will face challenges along the way, and today we will have a lot of discussion on these topics. There is the need for large infrastructure investments. You can't have a very easy migration to EVs without consumers feeling that they have opportunities to charge their vehicles wherever they are. As we spoke earlier, the grid has to be constantly supported and added to with renewable energy sources. We're going to have to deal with complex issues like what will we do at the end of life of batteries? Will we be creating a monster by unleashing a whole number of electric vehicles with batteries into a system that is unprepared to deal with end-of-life issues, recycling and reclaiming fairly expensive materials and rather poisonous or hazardous chemicals? And finally, we will deal with technology dynamics. I mean, we think of lithium-ion as a battery that's here to stay. But lithium-ion is characterized by so many different chemistries with so many different designs. So you have evolution in those chemistries, evolution in the format and the cell structures and the designs that go with them. So one can anticipate fairly fast obsolescence. So what we think of as a technology today is unlikely to be valid even 3 years from now. And this is an industry that will have to cope with very fast obsolescence, much faster than the auto industry has thus far had to deal with obsolescence. And finally, the last domain we will touch upon in the panel discussion today has to do with global trade and implications. There is no doubt that China has made a specific focus on electric vehicles with a very clear conclusion. They concluded that the conventional automobile with the internal combustion engine was something that they could never catch up with the West. And for them, the only way they could leapfrog the West was to forget about internal combustion engines and make a direct push to EVs, which China has very successfully done, and they will be global leaders in this business. But in the process, they have created a sense of fear and wariness amongst most global nations as to whether future auto industry and indeed the supply chain will all be China dominated. The auto industry and its components are a very large fraction of any industrial economy. And if, for example, if India were to take the course we took with smartphones for the EV industry, with a great deal of dependence on Chinese components and very large assemblies, it could lead to a disastrous consequence for our balance of trade. We would have transferred our lopsided trade imbalance in oil to a lopsided trade imbalance in electronics and components. So trade is going to be a very important aspect. Of course, policy is linked to this. In India, we've seen a number of initiatives related to Make in India initiatives, PLI supports and incentives, large-scale subsidies to create battery cell manufacturing in India, and very, shall I say, very generous subsidies and incentives to customers. So all of these will have a role to play in how this industry shapes up. I will now move the session to the discussion with the panelists. But first, let me say that, as I was mentioning in the preamble, when we were talking amongst the panelists, we couldn't have, or I should say, CIC couldn't have assembled a better Noah's Ark to represent the diverse perspectives that deal with EV industry. We have startups, we have legacy players, we have small two-wheeler manufacturers, we have three-wheelers, truck and bus makers. So we have the entire spectrum of perspectives that will be brought forward by three stellar panelists, all of whom I know very well. I count as dear friends, and it's an immense pleasure for me to be a part of this today. So I would now like to step into the panel discussion itself, but the format will be as follows. Each of the panelists will be requested to give a short 4 to 5 minute overview of their perspectives. And then we will go into a series of questions, and subsequently we will have a lot of time for question and answers to deal with what you as participants would like to have addressed. So do keep your questions noted, and we will have time to come to that. So without further ado, let me switch to the panel. Let me start with the youngest member. I think we will give the youngest member a chance to go first. So Tarun, I'll come to you. Would love to hear your short overall comments, opening comments on the subject and what you'd like to see.
Thank you, Dr. Sumantran. I would have preferred going last. So I think, and I'm sure as all the folks who are here on the call today have been following the EV industry up close. There has never been a better time to be building EV in India, arguably globally. Dr. Sumantran said a few times, it's no longer a question of if, but only when. I would say it's no longer a question of when also. I think we have passed that point. Actually, we're seeing it everywhere. The classic S-curve growth, the classic exponential growth is not very close ahead of us. I think we are in the middle of that growth right now. The entire scene has changed quite dramatically in the last 1 year. The clues were all there over the last 3-4 years. I think in India, and I certainly underestimated the role policy and government will play on the EV adoption. But I think a little similar to China, the policy has come firmly in favor of electric, more so than even I anticipated, honestly. And while the clues have been there for the last 3-4 years, with the government taking pretty strong stands and making fairly ambitious targets, the transition of the last 1 year has been quite dramatic. Electric, and not just in terms of the actual policy, that the reflection has been there in the form of what customers are actually seeing on the ground. I think that the biggest transformation is not actually policy or investors' mood or any of that. I think the biggest transition has been in the mood of the customer on the ground, who has gone from being mildly interested in this newfangled thing called electric to suddenly like, you know what, my next vehicle purchase is certainly electric. When we started Ather and we started sales about 3 years back, we were building up these experience centers, and I remember being very clear about it. We have to do a darn good job at building an experience center, because we have to convince people that electric is not a toy, electric is not just a fun thing, it's actually very real, it's very serious. Because we thought that we are up against a perception that electric is not for me, electric is not real, right? But I think now we're in a very different place where an average customer walking in is expecting electric to wow them, right? Pretty much everybody expects that electric is going to be an upgrade for them. Like everybody is expecting every electric vehicle to be like a Tesla Model S. Like it's going to be fantastic. It's going to be great leaps of faith of technology. And I think this is what's mostly changed the mood everywhere. Demand has been going up across actually every segment. I would like to say that it's only two-wheelers that are seeing higher demand, but honestly, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, electric cars, buses, trucks, there is no segment that I know of, including those small last mile mobility solutions, the kind that Yulu uses, right? Including them, there's been an explosion of startups building those. I think every electric vehicle is seeing a massive demand. And I think, because I was just going through the guest list and I noticed some of you, many of you probably are from the automotive world. Many of you are fairly large suppliers. So I think the biggest challenge that for all of us is just keeping up with this pace of change. The EV world has moved from one where you're creating new markets, you're creating new segments to sell electric, to a world of substitution, where every petrol vehicle segment is now starting to rapidly convert into, is getting substituted by an electric alternative. And this is going to create demand like we've never seen in the world, in the auto world. And I don't think any of us are generally prepared for it. There's a little bit of a shock on every front, on the supply chain side, on the capacity side, on the product side, where all of us are suddenly realizing that, holy shit, like there is demand, but we don't have the right products for those customers. We are almost selling them wrong products because that's the only option available. I think it's going to be a fun next couple of years as we go through these growth pangs and electric stops being a category or a segment. Electric is the only automotive category out there. Thank you, Dr. Samudra.
Thank you, Tarun. Very interesting. Let me jump from one extreme of a startup to a legacy player, from a two-wheeler to somebody who's dealing with trucks and buses as well, although Mahesh has done three-wheelers with Mahindra Electric. Mahesh, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Samudran. Yeah, so I entirely agree with the views Dr. you have said and Tarun's perspective. I think I want to just share my experience in last 6-7 years. Before that, I was completely I started off with a hardcore combustion engineer from engine and moved 7 years back into electric. Tarun can reflect what I'm saying. When I actually moved from a regular industry to an electric industry at the time, many of my colleagues said, are you doing the right decision? And I always want to do something related to technology and something related to futuristic, and it was perfectly fitting in. I remember Tarun visiting our Mahindra Electric factory 3-4 years back when he just moved to Bangalore. We were just starting, and there were no belief that electric is going to take off where we are today. But there was always a sense on two fronts, which I strongly believe from day one, is the need for the country and the need for the industry. The need for a country clearly says that the rate at which India is urbanizing and growing at the rate, the next decade or the decade which we are now going into cannot be handled with the same growth rate, with the same what energy need. And hence, there is clearly need for India to look at energy security and then look at mobility. If you have to look at growth rate in any country, I think it's directly proportional to the energy need and the mobility needs. And both of them have to be addressed in a very sustainable way. And India also has a very, I would say, important role right now, because we are growing at a stage where, not like West, when the energy was abundant and there was no conscious of environment, we are actually growing at the right time as a country to actually responsibly grow in both mobility and energy. I think that's where the whole fundamental looked at. And for this transition, as my Tarun said, the three important legs are very important. One is the policy making by the government, industry participation, and consumers. If these three doesn't come together, one of them are not working well, I think this S-curve is not going to reach where we are today. What I have seen in last 6-7 years, we were trying to initially make products and prove concepts, which actually made some awareness, brought in confidence in consumers, confidence in government. And then when the transformative mobility policy came by Niti Aayog in 2017, it's all very clear that government wants to promote electric mobility, both on energy side. They went into solar as well as renewable energies, as well as mobility into electric. The industry dilemma, I think that was very clear. We need to reduce oil import, we need to reduce pollution, and India has to become Atmanirbhar, and that's the direction country took, which was very happy to see in the last few years. The industry's dilemma, Dr. Sumantra has very rightly said, if you are a startup, you are extremely good, you have nothing at stake, you jump into it and then try what Tarun has done well, and then you bring new products, it's completely new to the system. The biggest challenge is existing auto players. The dilemma, the whole business is about dilemma, but the biggest dilemma in this is in this transition. The diesel and the gasoline margins are coming down because it's seen as not so futuristic, and you need a huge capex for the electric mobility to invest. And then the dilemma right now is how do we manage the existing P&L of the diesel and gasoline for the automakers, and how do we get cash for a huge investment which are needed for the electric investments. So there is no right or wrong answers. What I heard most of the times about Ashok Leyland and Mahindra, all of us are doing is auto industry is doing to carve out a separate entity which will be nimble, agile, operate like startups. At the same time, back up the corporations, back up on finance and support, on experience, which we need not learn again. I think it's both what I would say a challenge as well as an advantage. I see as an advantage because if these small team are given empowerment and worked on very agile like startups, really we can create huge products like what happened in Mahindra and now what Switch is trying to do. At the same time, you want some experience from large companies like Ashok Leyland. They can support us in systems process, which is really going to help to speed up and scale up when it is necessary. The industry challenge right now is on this transition. While we are talking about technology, I think cultural needs are very important. Training needs are very important. I think the most important thing is the organization which has the agility to quickly innovate the new business model. What I mean is not only EV. EV is just a product. As we all know, EV is a complete ecosystem. It's no more a product sale. It's going to be an experience sale. So people are going to buy experience. You have already seen even in buses, people don't want to buy buses. They are now tendering into GCC model where you are gross contract running the vehicle, and people who are traveling or who is going to experience your services and not going to buy just a product. So it needs a complete ecosystem of charging, product and consumer experience in the product, which is going to be a huge package, which it is. And hence, culturally, you have to transform a company which is a product selling to an experience selling company, which is happening in auto industry at a great level. While I said what's happening in the OEM, the biggest challenge is in parts makers. You know that there is a 7% contribution on GDP, and there is a huge, large, skilled manpower who's working on tier 1, tier 2, who's the suppliers of OEMs. There is a huge challenge there. And what I believe government is done with the PLI scheme of auto, both for components and this, they have given a boost. They have given a boost to the struggling sector because they are hugely having a dilemma on investment because they just completed all the Euro 6 investments and they are looking at returns, and there is a huge investment needed to transition to electric. I think government has played a very vital role in supporting the demand, supporting the industry, both startup and large industries. And they have also now supported through PLI scheme for battery manufacturing as well as some component manufacturing. I think with this right approach, if these three legs, which is the government policy making, industry and the consumers, step together, I'm happy to say today, last month, I was told that there is more demand in market than can be produced in two-wheelers and three-wheelers till last month. And the same is in bus in a few things, because most of the tenders are yet to be served and industry is gearing up. So the three segments, two-wheelers, three-wheelers and buses, already the demand is coming more than the what I would say anybody can manage the supply, which is a good thing to do. The last one is going to be on the shared. And before I end, I think while we do all this, India cannot achieve mobility needs of 1 billion people, 1.3 billion people, just by buying individual vehicles, whether it is two-wheelers or three-wheelers. I think it is important that we'll have to bring people who are having individual owners to a public transport, either metros or buses or last mile connectivity and things like that. While there will be a need of individual ownership of vehicle, both in two-wheelers and four-wheelers, if we have to be in 2030, there is a very clear study says that almost 50% of the ride Indians going to take in 2030, if we reach that GDP level and the mobility needs, has to be in a shared way. And that's where it's happening around. And that's going to give up new business models on experience. And that's where we are looking forward.
Thank you, Mahesh. A lot of topics we will come back to. One can excuse Tarun and Mahesh's exuberance and passion for this business. They've been, embedded in EVs all their lives, or at least much of their lives recently, and they're committed to it. As managing director of Cholamandalam Finance, you can't afford any emotion. You can't afford passion to drive your judgment. So, your take on a group like the Murugappa Group, well established in so many sectors. I know you've had earlier, you dipped your feet in the water of EV scooters, but would like to understand your perspectives and also a little bit about what made the group feel that this is the time to make a big push into a very new and a very different vertical. So over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Sumatran, and good evening, everyone. So, I think that's a good question, right? Because, our position, if you take starting position, and TI and Chola in slightly different places, because Chola is looking at it more from a funding perspective and an opportunity. But from TI's position, we were faced with a very interesting starting position because we were predominantly supplying to the auto industry. Almost 70% of our revenue at the time was coming from the auto industry. And just like Mahesh Babu just mentioned, the parts makers are the guys who actually kind of have to worry about kind of continuous investments because, the OEMs actually kind of have more control over destiny. And the parts makers kind of are more dependent on what the OEMs do, right? And so TI from that perspective faced a real dilemma, right? And I think, I just went back to, one of those old things that you always learn in organizational behavior, right? Which is that it's important for us to control our own destiny or someone else will try to do it, right? And so from that perspective, we just decided from TI that it was going to be imperative to basically look at it more from, what is an OEM, what are the benefits that, you could get kind of being a first mover versus basically waiting to kind of look at how we could be another supplier in the EV space as well. Though in some of our businesses, we will continue to be a supplier. If you take our tubes business, front forks and two-wheelers still exist, and so we'll continue to grow there. But clearly, some of our businesses we recognize are going away, right? Our auto chains business, we're a very large manufacturer of chains for both two-wheelers and then cam chains for four-wheelers and three-wheelers as well. But basically, what we began to see was a shift where some of our businesses were going to become obsolete, and in an electric world, and so it became imperative for us to act. And not to wait, right? I mean, it became imperative for us to act fairly quick. So then it became more of a decision as to where do we play, right? And, and how do we play in kind of the space. So I think how, we very quickly kind of came to the thinking that it'll be better to be at least an OEM in some sectors, versus actually being a part supplier. Because we did not, we see a lot of key components being kept by the EV manufacturers themselves. at this point in time. So we just felt like that shift would be a useful shift. But then there is still a big question as to, where do you decide to play? Kind of, do you go into two-wheelers? Do you go into three-wheelers? Do you go into buses? And this is a very interesting question, because I think it's very dependent on how the space is going to play out in India, right? And like you said, this whole space is the darling of investors, and Tarun is a darling of the investors, and has done very well in terms of kind of getting which I think is very important, right? I mean, like Mahesh mentioned, the ecosystem. You need investors who are going to basically back this, right? And one decision we came to, Dr. Sumantran, is that, we felt like two-wheelers was going to be, too investor-led, right? I mean, we are in the end kind of a good South Indian conservative, kind of family business. And to play the game at the stakes that, Tarun and some of the others are playing it at, we just felt would be tougher for us, right? Because again, we have to channel profits from an existing profitable business into this, and we couldn't see playing it at that level, right? And so but I think what is going to happen in two-wheelers is going to be, I feel, kind of fairly earth-shattering in terms of what's going to happen, right? Because I think at the rate they're going, between the subsidies, right, which are kind of now running up to almost 50,000 rupees kind of for a two-wheeler, and what's happening with kind of the supply side coming into India with battery capacity and all of that, I honestly feel like, we will achieve price parity between IC and two-wheeler kind of, in the two-wheeler space, between IC and electric in perhaps the next, 4 years tops, right? It may happen sooner, if the subsidies kind of roll on to FAME 3 and battery prices kind of come down at the rate we're thinking. And so in my mind, kind of, I can actually see a scenario whereby, 5 years from now, there are no new IC two-wheelers being sold in this country, right? And that can, I mean, it can get to that level, because honestly, if we get to price parity and people don't have to kind of deal with paying for fuel in an electric two-wheeler, or much less for fuel in a recharging situation, I can't see why people would stick with IC two-wheelers, right? And similarly, then we saw a lot of opportunity in three-wheelers, because we actually see that, one of the challenges we found with two-wheelers, obviously, is that, an average two-wheeler in the country kind of runs 40 kilometers a day or 1,000 kilometers a month. But because of range anxiety, you want two-wheelers to be capacitized to about at least 120 kilometer run, which means that in effect, the battery power would be far exceeding kind of, what you would get. And given that the battery, what you would usually run at, and given that the battery is almost like, a significant part of the electric three-wheeler cost or two-wheeler, we felt like there was a slight imbalance there. But in three-wheelers there, we found almost a perfect balance, right? Because basically an average three-wheeler is running about 120 kilometers a day. Most batteries, like Mahesh knows, are being capacitized to about 150 or so, 120, 150, somewhere in that range. And so we actually think that space is fairly, well kind of designed for electric. And like Mahesh himself knows, having kind of, been behind the Trio and some of the leading products in the space, we actually think that space is really going to take off fairly quickly, because again, it's a productive asset. It's not really a consumptive asset, right? So given some of those characteristics, we've kind of, we've chosen a particular space to go into. And now I think the jury's out as to kind of whether that will be the right space or not, and what space it will scale at. But I definitely think that, given the broader ecosystem points that both Mahesh and Tarun alluded to, the rate of change, my personal prognosis is that it's going to be faster than we think, right? That I would not be, like I said, I would not be surprised if 5 years from now, India did not sell a single IC two-wheeler, right? Especially if we achieve this price parity, which I think can get there if the government continues its subsidies. And honestly, I think I'm hoping that the government will. So actually, I think that has massive implications for our ecosystem, right? I mean, like I've told our chains guys, hey, listen, you have to think how you're going to backfill, kind of 1,000 crores in revenue because you're only going to have the aftermarket to deal with at some point in time, right? And I think it's clear. I mean, everybody's kind of thinking about when this will happen, but I really feel like it is going to happen in a much more accelerated time frame than we think.
Lovely. I should have added that apart from the Cholamandalam MD perspective, you would bring the perspective of what you, in your words, good conservative South Indian family business. Lovely. So when we go to the Q&A, I always like to start the question that deals with consumers and their experience first, because we in the industry would love to kind of wrap ourselves around our industry and what we do. But let's focus for a minute on consumers and their expectations. Tarun talked about the wow factor. I've had customers, Tesla customers, new Tesla customers a couple of years ago in raptures about their product and telling me how, the complete car broke down in the garage 3 months after it was bought new. And wow, did you know by OTA and over the air, they were able to get it up and running. And I was there going, my God, if I'd sold you a car from General Motors that had broken down 3 months from new, whatever I did, you wouldn't tell me wow. So there is this wow factor and seems to be capable of forgiving a lot of sins, which is good. I mean, any new innovation needs that. But let's get in a little deeper into consumers' expectation. There are a number of aspects to this. There is, of course, design, styling, experience, the smoothness, lack of smoke, lack of dealing with petrol pumps, all of that, and the fact of and the economics, as we talked about, total cost of ownership, and even if they don't formally calculate total cost of ownership, the experience they have of shelling money out of their pocket every time they go to fill up or charge up and so on. So let me just now change the sequence. Mahesh, I'll come to you first. You have dealt more with commercial customers who have a very different take on what their experience is and what they take away. So in just 1 or 2 minutes, because I'll have to give this, we've got a number of questions and I want to go through all the panelists. So why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, Sumudran, it's right to look at consumers. When I went to this segment, I think we'll have to bifurcate EV into two. One is the personal use and another is the commercial use. The personal use of EV is going to be more of a lifestyle and emotional buy, and maybe to just show, to tell you that he or she is an environmental thing. And those numbers initially were low and that numbers are going up now. The commercial is very important, I believe, for the country, for the industry, and for the society in India, because the commercial application are the one the buyers who wants to improve their life. Actually, when I went into Trio's consumers, actually somebody said I am earning 4,000 to 5,000 a month higher, and which I can afford to now educate my second child. So that is the difference you are making in the life of the people when you are doing something in commercial. And I personally feel EV is a perfect fit for commercial, where you are able to actually make a difference in their life. For example, when we went into electric three-wheeler, women were buying electric three-wheelers and moving from domestic help to driving Trio, because the three-wheeler is now easy by drive-by-wire, you don't need clutch. So you are making a societal shift. The lady who was doing a domestic help was earning about 12,000. Now she is earning 25,000, and which she is now educating a second child, doing things to her family. So the commercial vehicle segment should leverage the lower operating cost and convert the life of the people to a better lifestyle. I think that is the most important, irrespective of three-wheelers, last mile connectivity, mid-mile, or buses. I think this is what is the primary objective, and I believe EV we have demonstrated in three-wheeler. I'm sure we can do it in multiple mid-mile and last mile deliveries and so on.
Verlaine, how are you as a group coming into this sector? You've been in components, you know the industry well, but first time as a B2C business. How have you seen customer expectations and anything unique about what you had to deal with compared to what you expected?
Yes. So Sumatra, so like Mahesh, I think correctly said, right? I mean, you've got to kind of stratify it into, and he called it commercial and personal, and, I call it, productive and consumptive, right? Because basically, kind of, when you look at the productive assets, and that's why we've chosen to kind of go with the productive assets, because here it's a very economic decision, right? What's driving it is that I can see kind of the clear economic benefit of moving to electric, right? And that's what we like, both from Chola's perspective and TI's perspective, right? Which is, from Chola's perspective, we like funding, productive assets, because it's easier to kind of deal with, somebody that's looking at something that is going to basically help their livelihood, right? And that's what we're seeing, right? And all of the market research we've been doing, that's what we're seeing. People want to switch because they believe that it is going to help improve livelihoods, right? So actually, I mean, I think kind of Tarun's going to be in a better position kind of to talk about the consumptive and the personal side. But to me, kind of, there's just a significant economic reason to make this change, right? And that's why we're seeing a lot of people going to do it. In addition to the points that Mahesh raised, which I think are totally accurate in terms of, easier to drive, and all of those other additional points as well.
So Tarun, I know I can expect the wow experience to be amplified when you talk about the consumer experience. But I want you to delve a little more into this. When the Kinetic Honda came into India, it suddenly saw a lot of women riders get onto scooters. Again, there was no clutch, no gear change. All of a sudden, it was just a CVT transmission. It probably had a big impact on society. More women getting onto scooters and becoming familiar. What kind of consumer experience do you expect to happen with this shift to electrics?
I think what the Kinetic Honda and then potentially after that Honda Activa were able to do, Dr. Sumantran, I think they are very high barriers. They're very high bars. And honestly, the kind of impact they had on society are quite profound, on people, right? I'm not, actually, society is probably, I think EVs will also have a equally powerful, if not bigger impact because of the environmental and everything else. But if you think from just a people perspective, I think honestly, Kinetic Honda had a very, very huge impact because the it literally brought mobility to half of the population, which was not really feasible in the past. And today where EVs are, I don't think any of us are going to claim that, that's the kind of change we're bringing about. I think EV is not bringing that large a change. I think what's going to see, and which is why I actually alluded to it in my 5 minutes, that certainly the EV story is less about, let's create a new segment, let's open up a new use case. To certainly, it's become like a mad rush that, listen, every existing customer segment now sees value in going electric. And as much as a product guy, I wanted to resist that temptation. The reality is that, listen, if there is an existing customer segment, there is a clear need, there's a clear use case. You know what? We'll discover new use cases later. Let's just first give them what they need here. There is revenue just waiting for you. So I think it's not very prudent to not first capture that. It's a little bit of a steroidic growth, and but you have to play the game as it is set. So that's what's happening right now. What's driving this are 2 reasons. First, I would say, is the cost, and it's not the TCO, because I don't think any customer is actually correctly able to calculate TCO today, right? If you talk to an average customer, all of them think, I drive 1,000 kilometers a month, right? You don't. Actually, you're driving 400 kilometers a month, right? You think you're driving 40 kilometers a day. You're not actually driving 40 kilometers a day. You live in Ahmedabad, you drive 12 kilometers every day, right? But somehow everybody just does a very terrible TCO, and they just all end up thinking, I spend 3,000-4,000 rupees a month in petrol, right? So, and the fact that petrol's breached 100 rupees a liter, it's a psychological barrier, and it's kind of stayed past it for too long, has started pushing a lot of people, especially in the urban areas, that, listen, this is not coming down. I don't want to live with this just nagging pain of the amount, that 500 rupee note that I have to give to a petrol attendant every week, man. Right. So it's just too painful in my head. So I want to get rid of it. Right. I don't want to live on the tyranny of what petrol prices might be tomorrow. Right. So I think that it's not actual TCO math, though the actual TCO math is not terrible. It's given the current subsidy structure is honestly quite favorable. but people are overblowing and overseeing the advantage there, right? And a huge number of people are overseeing that advantage. The second factor is, and that's it's again based in cost, but it's not really cost, which is that I think our tool industry has done a terrific job of cost optimization over the last 20 years. Honda Activa launched at something like 50,000 rupees. I remember when I was in like 9th or 8th standard, like roughly about 18, 19 years back, right? And it's gone up to like 80, 85,000 rupees 20 years later. It's not kept in pace with inflation. So what's kind of happened is the same middle class has way more purchasing power, but not enough options. So contrary to everybody's popular belief, people are actually very happy to spend a little bit more. Everybody keeps thinking, oh, scooty is 50,000 rupees. Like, no, scooty is 50,000 rupees. In fact, 30% of the urban customers are now buying a scooter in the 1 lakh to 1.1 lakh rupee on-road price, right? And Ntorq is 1 lakh and Suzuki Bergman is 1.1 lakh. And we're not talking about like super premium things like Vespa and Aprilia. Everybody still keeps thinking wrong, like how much Indian customers are willing to pay or can pay. So what's kind of happening is the minute you go and tell them, you know what, you're thinking of buying a 1 lakh rupee Honda Activa 125cc, I'll sell you an electric scooter at 1.1 lakh or 1.2 lakhs. That's an electric, right? Like that's a leap forward, right? Instead of buying a mechanical hunk, you are going to be buying like this digital electric product, right? People are like almost like, finally, I'll just buy something new. For freshness sake, heck, I'll buy something new, right? I think these are the primary two reasons. I think a lot of purchasing powers opened up, but everybody's been in such a mad rush to repeat the success of Honda Activa that, in a sense, people haven't tried building better products for a while. And electric just becomes that breath of fresh air.
Excellent. I remember a very famous auto industry leader once telling me, customers don't buy an automotive product for their needs. They buy an automotive product for what their potential needs or what they think their needs are. So if they want a range, they don't think about their daily range, they think about what I couldn't. That's why you need a 7-seater SUV, although I don't know how many people ever use the 7 seats in an SUV. So this is a fundamental learning from the auto industry. Not to mention the other important learning, which is welcome to the club, because this industry is never going to give you the opportunity to keep pace with inflation.
No, I think you talk about a very interesting point, and it's been pretty much our founding belief. Too many consulting reports talk from a perspective of what the country needs, of what the market should need. But no consumer is buying from what the country needs, right? The country needs you to buy small, tiny cars that are all electric, that, but the consumer wants to buy an XUV 500, right? The consumer wants to buy eventually like a freaking Toyota Innova, right? Or like a really nice car, a really nice bike. So, yeah, people are not buying what they can buy.
Let's move on. Obviously, with an industry going through this kind of transformation, we can't limit our focus to OEMs. We can't limit our focus to a Mahindra or an Ather or whatever. An industry means tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, a supply chain, capability, competence, components. And very often we only think about batteries, which by the way, in my association with Grintech, I've come to learn. We thought the IC engine was complicated. Well, wait till you get into batteries and understand what a battery really is and what a lithium-ion battery has to do. And then you realize that it's a fairly comprehensive hunk of machine. And on top of that, you've got motors, motor controllers, DC to DC converters, chargers, fast chargers. So for an industry to evolve, you're going to have that entire ecosystem have to go along with you. So developing an industry, and as 3 of you represent OEMs, you will have to work with and kind of bring along this entire supply chain along with you. So I'd like to have you share a little bit about that experience. Well, let me start with you. You've spoken already about the role of TI, but as you've embarked on this venture, how have you seen that aspect of the business?
Yeah, I think, and it's like the way we've seen it is this, right? Which is, you're right, the ecosystem does not exist, right? And the ecosystem, I would say, is very immature for component. Obviously, you have kind of two sets of components going in. One is the set that basically will continue to kind of exist, that exists in both IC and in electric. The second is going to be the components that only exist in electric. The components that only exist in electric, like you said, battery, motor controller, the ecosystem does not exist. And also, like we're seeing in some of these new products, the ecosystem does not exist anywhere. Right? The three-wheeler as a vehicle form itself is not kind of developed in the Western world. So nobody's thinking about kind of developing motors that are, whatever, right? I mean, we're talking about kind of 6 kilowatt, 9 kilowatt. In that range, nobody's kind of thinking about motors. And so almost you have to think of how is this ecosystem really going to evolve, right? And you have to help mostly people are either taking kind of motors with higher capacity, taking the same technology and dumbing it down a bit. And, I think we have an interesting perspective because we also have CG, which is in motors, but not in electric motors, as in EV motors yet. So what we're clearly seeing is that there's going to be a lot of development needed. And some of this development is going to be India first, right? I mean, Tarun's approach, and obviously he can answer for himself, they developed everything from scratch, right? But, kind of our approach is that we have to develop a very good supplier ecosystem. But it is going to take a while to mature, right? Because these are kind of, these are components that do not exist anywhere, right? So it's not like we're copying what the Western world has, because you have to kind of develop some of this from scratch. So I think that from that perspective, it's going to be quite interesting.
Mahesh, your views. You've seen supply chains develop at Mahindra. You're having to do that with Switch Mobility. How is it that, we all agree that the health of an industry is only as good as the health of its supply chain. And how do you see that develop in India over the next few years?
Yeah, I would say 2 stages, 5 years back and now. I think it's a substantial difference. 5 years back, when we approach tier 1 suppliers, they will not even entertain you for any part in EVs, because they would, there is a saying in always, first when you go and ask for RFQ, people will say, what is your volume and what is the numbers for next 5 years to 10 years, which never existed for EVs 5 years back. So it eventually led most of the OEMs to develop their own technologies. Like we developed motors, battery packs, because nobody else was willing to do that. And that also helped to OEMs to learn the technology so that we can ask better over a period of time. So that's the learning curve initially what has happened. I think now we are finding a little bit more investment happened at suppliers end, because the belief has gone from OEMs to suppliers now. With PLI, it's going to increase. There are a lot of interest now being shown for components like motor controllers, DC-DC and power electronics, and even battery packs. There are a lot of startups who have want to do only BMS and battery packs. I think this is a very encouraging situation now, where there are startups in component supply, and there are also established tier 1 suppliers who are interested in investing. I think this is a very healthy sign. This will reduce cost and it will increase scale. It's good for the OEM as well as the consumer.
Tarun, I know I've seen Ather's progress over the years, and I have often singled you out as Ather as somebody to emulate in India, being confident of doing design, development, and building a supply chain in India. So what were the challenges you faced along the way?
I think, Dr. Sundaran, the challenges very early on were just realizing that we are in a different world now. Everything that we learned about the current OEM model, which I remember somebody telling me it's a supplier-driven innovation model, right? And OEMs really have to, if you're an OEM, you have to do a really terrific job of supply chain management and product planning, right? Everything that we, however, saw on ground building electric kind of went against that, and it took us a while to realize that the challenge is not that suppliers are not good. The problem is that we are back to maybe where the IC engine world was like in the 30s or I don't know 20s, right? You can't expect a Bosch to have, like a really solid battery tested over the last 15 years in Japan and Germany, and like 1 trillion kilometers over it. Like, no, like nobody's built that battery for a two-wheeler ever, anywhere, right? Like no supplier is at fault. And the biggest problem that we realize after a while is that most of the supply chain is struggling because they don't actually have any understanding of what the customer needs in an EV product, right? And that layer is the OE, and the communication gap between the OE understanding the customer's current requirements, going back to potential supply chain partners, explaining it to them, and then kind of encouraging them to invest in that technology direction, and then getting a useful component out of it at scale at the right cost. Like with the pace EV industry is changing, like you will just do the charity to the entire world and you will die as an OE, right? So it took us a while to realize that very early on, and hence conclude that we are in a place where maybe the storage industry or maybe the entire computer industry was maybe about 30-40 years back. You're going to be very vertically integrated, like the very original IBM possibly was, until technology hits a certain amount of certain point, volumes hit a certain point, and then all that you're doing in-house will certainly be outsourced. You will do what maybe Maruti or Hero and all these guys did like 40 years back, created a lot of things in-house and then sort of spun it all out, right? Because it made sense to things that kind of stabilized. It was operational efficiency that was needed, not a lot of product innovation. But we are in a place where a lot of product innovation is happening, and doing the dance with like a lot of suppliers together is actually very difficult. Which is why we kind of ended up going down this path of we will take the lead on most critical components today, right? And start by bringing in build to print suppliers as opposed to proprietary partners on board. And as things start stabilizing, gradually move out some of these things to people who are willing to take that kind of an investment, right? So go to a motor supplier or go to a battery supplier at a point when somebody says, you know what, I'm putting in $1 billion and I'm going to go to make battery packs that you guys have already figured out, but I'm going to operationally do it better than you guys. So I think learning that and understanding that we're in a different world was the biggest challenge for us.
But perhaps that also, like everything else in the industry, is changing faster than we expect. I see BMW i3. They first designed and built their own motor for the i3, and now they said they'll no longer build their own motors. They built their own battery pack for the i3, and now they're going to go to CATL for the next model. So literally within a generation, we've already come to the realization that maybe it is the rapid adoption of EV components by the larger suppliers, and equally the realization that you can't expect BMW, for example, to stay on top of every battery chemistry and every battery performance experience that somebody like CATL is going through. So we're probably seeing that shift also happen faster than, just like we talked about the earlier issues of change that is coming up with electric. But I want to get to another topic as well. This whole, particularly coming more focused, bringing more focus to India, there is palpable fear amongst policymakers, amongst industry, and perhaps among some consumers that this migration, if we execute this migration the way we adopted smartphones, we will have a hell of a job. We would have done a hell of a job because we will end up with a massive dependence on China. Even we see that even now, a huge amount of the initial kits that were coming in various guises through FAME 1. Fortunately, FAME 2 has already started to put some brakes on this. But how do you, there is still a concern that if our country, Chennai evolved to be a Detroit of the East. Chennai prides itself at one time of being called Detroit of the East. We have auto clusters in India, Gurgaon, and Pune, and Chennai, and subsequently even Uttaranchal. If this industry's ecosystem can't be sustained and there are easy resorts to Chinese imports, we would have served ourselves the way we served ourselves with smartphones. So the important the point I would like you to address would be, how do you see this migration happening? Clearly, it's a question of scale, capabilities, investments, and particularly at a time when China seems to now have peaked out on some of its investments, and there is talk of massive overcapacities in China, all the more creating the specter of products being dumped or coming in through various channels. So how do you deal with this issue from an India point of view? Let me start with Vellayan.
Yeah, honestly, I believe that with the right policy, and I think that the government is working on policy to support this, we are going to see a massive ecosystem develop in India, right? I don't think there's anybody, like you said, given the amount of kind of news and attention EVs are getting, I don't think any of the businesses I think every business is thinking about, should they be doing something here, right? I mean, I know from CG, we're looking at motors, motor controllers, right? And if we are, then, I know that probably kind of at least 5 or 6 other people are, perhaps even 10, 20 other people, right? You've got the entire startup ecosystem where, a lot of people are kind of approaching it from that perspective. So I think between legacy players and, and startups, you've got so many people looking at the entire supplier ecosystem as well, whether it's batteries, whether it's motors, whether it's controllers, anything that's kind of new. That definitely, I don't see that level of China. The China dependence could be there initially, but I think that it's going to go away fairly quickly as volumes begin to pick up, right? Between policy and between volumes picking up, I think that will go away. Like you said, with the i3, I think the reverse will happen here, which is maybe will be China dependent for one generation, but the second generation on, I think, Indian supply is going to pick up across all of these.
Mahesh, how about you?
I think, Dr. Sundran, what I see is, I think there is a localization mindset in India's industry. Means somebody wants to bring a part already localized to India has been the mindset for component and other industry over a period of, I have seen in my career many years. I think we need to look at the funding portion related to research, pilot, and scaling up production, like what US have done on the Department of Energy on talking about initial trials. I think we need to create something around that where we take a risk and say that government, industry, and maybe academia will invest on early funding for so much. They will do some trial, pilot, then you scale up on production. Eventually, the supply chain is going to be global. We like it or don't like it, it's going to be global. Whether it is going to be from China, you are going to get it from some Taiwan, or you are going to get it somewhere. We don't have natural resources of everything in one country, and it's going to be a global supply chain. The question we have to ask is, what is the value add we are creating in the new technology domain, particularly which is being need of the hour globally? Or are we going to localize things which have been already productionized in many parts of the country? I think we have to go to the first stage, not on the second stage mindset.
Okay, thank you. Tarun, anything to add?
No, not much. I don't think we're going to see a repeat of what happened on the mobile phone industry here, simply because unlike the mobile phone industry, we actually have a pretty large, massive automotive industry in India, especially on the two-wheeler side and three-wheeler side. So at least there's somebody who will put up a fight, right? And there's a strong supplier base, which basically have enough entrepreneurs with enough entrepreneurial reasons to sort of, continue to exist and not just disappear, right? The mobile phone industry wasn't really exactly the same. And even today, when you look at it, and we haven't really seen EV volumes yet grow, right? It's still a very early stage of growth. But despite that, most of us, apart from lithium-ion cells, are really not importing much from China. I think if at this point people are still importing tons of stuff from China to build an EV, there's something significantly wrong. I think at least most mature programs now have no direct significant reliance from China. Their chips might be coming from Taiwan, your displays might be coming from Singapore or Malaysia. Yes, it's a global supply chain. In an EV and a connected vehicle, you cannot say, listen, I'm going to buy within like 50 kilometers of Chennai. It's going to be a little struggle, right? But I think the specific challenge that, listen, everything's coming from China, like far from it. There is a little bit of a raw material struggle for magnets and maybe certain components of lithium-ion cells. But I think on those, a bunch of things in play, I'm hopeful that over the next 5 years, that also kind of comes down. But certainly not a place where, we are importing everything, just badging things here, not even close to it now. We've moved far away.
Good. I think we'll segue to the related topic. I think it was Vellayan who said earlier, obviously, policy is going to be a very important element to help shape this industry trajectory. And I think I also heard Mahesh and Tarun agree. The government seems to have, stepped up to the plate on this subject. Whether we're talking about subsidies to customers, I mean, what FAME2 is doing is really, in my view, very generous. They're rewarding OEMs more than the cost of the battery for what they will be buying. So they're doing a lot to stimulate demand. They're doing a lot in terms of thinking long term and saying we need cell manufacturing capacity in India. They've set up a plan for up to 50 gigawatt hours of capacity. There's this Make in India scheme. There is a PLI schemes. Many states have also stepped up to offer. So without falling into the trap of only asking what the government can do, it is still legitimate to talk about, from a policy point of view, what else needs to be done to shape the entire ecosystem. Anything that you believe needs to be done beyond what's being done right now? Let me start this time with Mahesh. Mahesh, I think today you were in the conclave with the transport minister. Fresh from those inputs, anything that you can say on this?
Okay, Dr. Samanthan. Yeah, Dr. Swandhu Sinha was there from Niti Aayog. So I think most importantly, what I like government is doing is it started off with the demand incentive FAME2, came up with ACC PLI, which helped the battery, and an auto and component PLI, which is really helping OEM and component manufacturer. I think what I understand, what they are rightly doing is now they are getting into downstream on anode, cathodes, and slurries and raw materials, and ensuring the supply chain, supporting this pipeline. Like what exactly Energy did some time back on not just setting up power plants, but they linked the coal supply and things like that towards to make the energy happen, energy generation happen. Similarly, what happened in solar they started off with an incentive to put a solar panel. Now they are giving an incentive for making the panel, and so on and so forth. So I think that is the right direction government is doing. And if they continue to do what they are doing, I am very hopeful that this is going to help.
Belen, anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, I first off, totally say I'm supportive of what the government is doing. I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job. I think Mahesh kind of alluded to some of the details. I've only got one pet peeve from a selfish perspective, and that is that they've left e-bicycles out, right? And so it's actually kind of a very interesting, like India's got a whole spectrum, right? And we now sell e-bicycles unsubsidized at about 20,000 rupees, right? But actually, if you look at the use cases, this price point is kind of significantly less than anything else, in the e-world. And you can get to the same speeds, I've tested, you can get to the same speeds. You can go from one end of Chennai to the other in exactly the same time, pretty much as you can in a two-wheeler. It's a lot more maneuverable. And pretty much, most two-wheelers anyway, they're kind of traveling kind of with only one passenger. They've somehow, and I guess it's our fault to a certain extent, we've not made it aspirational enough. But honestly, if this product was subsidized, I think kind of you'd have a whole new category that kind of exists in India, which is basically an e-transport kind of mechanism that is, say that sells at less than $200. And I think it will really make a difference, because you will cut down on the number of e-two-wheelers you need, because a lot of people will switch at that price point.
Actually, it's a very valuable point to make. I suppose you want to borrow a page out of Boris Johnson's policy, encouraging active travel, as he calls it. And when Britain wants to build back better, they want to build back with more bike pathways and e-bikes that have some amount of pedal assist and some amount of e-motor. Yeah. So frankly, it makes a lot of sense for India. All the points you mentioned are absolutely spot on. Lower cost, more affordable, less CO2 emissions, less space, and potentially a healthier lifestyle. I do encourage you and your association. You guys need to muster up your association to be as strong as Siam and ACMA.
Well, yeah, I know that's the first thing. But we've also the issue that came is basically because there is no because it's not a licensed product and all that. This does not fall under the remit of all of the people who are setting policy, right? So then actually we've tried and they're just not interested in it. But maybe we can talk to you after about helping us on that cause.
I don't know, anything on your side from policy and government?
Dr. Samudran, I don't want to add much, lest it seem like we're not being gracious of the current policy on offer. Just one comment I'll make though. I think not a subsidy, not an incentive, but something I've been speaking for a while, and you've been also behind. Charging. We need to get more chargers before we sell vehicles. I'm actually becoming more and more convinced that we are going about it the wrong way. First, trying to convince people to buy EVs and then figuring out how do I install chargers at your house. We need to figure out ways to get chargers in every parking location, and that will encourage more people to buy EVs. And frankly, that's far cheaper than any subsidy at the vehicle level, right? But I will not talk much because I know that the government's also keen about this and there is good work happening behind the scenes on all of it. So that's my one hope of seeing.
Do promote the idea, because I think the low-cost EV charger is something that is again ideally suited for India, and it will help address this particular issue. I have been keeping track of the Q&A from the chat boxes. Fortunately, I think many of the questions have been addressed. One we will come to, or two we will come to. There was questions about grid capacity, hubs for EV manufacturing, like we have hubs for auto manufacturing. But I want to come to two questions that we have not addressed. One important one is end of life. Just like you mentioned now, Tarun, we need some things to go in tandem. You have to have charging infrastructure to go in tandem with demand growth. And similarly, now while there is a lag effect in terms of recycling, we potentially have a large population of other lithium-ion batteries that we may make a start with for end of life. Because if at some stage, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, we start to see end of life for a number of EV two-wheelers or three-wheelers. And I know some OEMs would say, no, our batteries are good for 7 years. But nevertheless, we must allow for an increase in volume of end of life for batteries around 4 or 5 years from now. This is an industry that takes a lot of time to get to be established, recycling, recovering, and the entire value chain that goes with it. So I'll start with you, Tarun, first, and then go on to the others.
I am a fairly firm believer that there has economic incentive, and the minute there is an economic incentive, I think business will follow to solve the problem. And the good news with EVs is that every electric vehicle has a ridiculous amount of valuable scavenged material at the end of life, right? First, things like batteries in particular do not end their life in an automotive, right? Like, because most people go for a replacement at the 60-70% life mark, at which point the battery has got still several years of healthy usage left in it, which is where we will see a lot of economical reason for either OEMs themselves in partnerships with others to sort of not just throw a battery pack, because that battery pack is probably still worth 10,000 rupees. So there will be good economic reasons for all of us to find ways to move that to stationary power storage. And then once the life is done there, the reality is that 3 kWh battery is still sitting with kgs of aluminium, copper, nickel, like incredibly high value raw material, like material sitting inside it. There's no way in a country like India or China, stuff like that gets just thrown off in a dumpster, right? Like that's going to be recycled down to the last metal, just like how we see lead acid batteries seeing recycling rates of 99.7%. No reason to believe that lithium-ion batteries will not see a very, very similar recycling. And because while you may argue that the technology is probably still not there in India, a lot of this is getting developed given the global passenger car market outside, which is already a few years into growth. So I think we'll see enough of that seeping into India purely because there's a very strong economic rationale. Would the government need to support this by policy? Honestly, I think if it does, sure, the government might prevent a few years of some wastage of the early few 10,000 or 100,000 vehicles. But even if the government does not do an economic incentive, I think there's enough meat in it for people to jump in at roughly the right time.
Okay. Brilliant.
I agree with Tarun. Right? There's a lot of economic value in it, and India is very good at kind of extracting that value when it's there.
Mahesh, anything to add?
Oh, I think most of them are talked about. I agree with that.
I think the challenge will be, when every technology or everything we have to do gets more complex, the more you go a little bit deeper into it. And, similar with batteries, you can start to talk about material separation and the processes of, segregation of materials. These are all very highly technically complex areas. I agree with Tarun. It's not discovery of new processes because these are being made. It's a question of economies of making this work. But this is a very important subject for the country, and I know that it is receiving some attention, but it is something that needs constant highlighting because this can create an environmental tragedy at a time when we've been trying to address the environment issue with the migration to EVs. I'm avoiding some of the questions that are directed at one panelist about their company and their investment. I felt that was probably not what you would want to answer at this time. But there is a question about, when we've been talking about EVs, the question is, this is from Sridhar, are we going to shun fuel cells and not talk about fuel cells at all? My initial take would be that fuel cells effectively are still an electric vehicle, just that the source of power is in this case not a battery, but some sort of, whether it's hydrogen or an alcohol or a carbon fuel-based fuel cell, and then you provide electricity, which may still use batteries in an intermediate phase. But any comments any of you would have on what you want, particularly Mahesh Babu, I'll come to you because heavy trucks and buses might be logical application platforms for fuel cells. How do you see fuel cells coming into India?
Dr. Sumantran, you're right, but I will slightly modify that. It is still a EV with a small battery, and you have a range extender fuel cell which feeds more electricity for driving as well as charging. So basically, fuel cell is nothing but a range extended electric smaller battery in the one. I think it addresses the segment what Dr. you rightly said. EVs right now are more what I would say easy and productionizable up to, let's say, 300 kilometers in commercial vehicles. And if it goes beyond that, which is between cities and across the country, then we need a vehicle which will be filled, which needs energy replacement in just 2-3 minutes because the truck has to keep moving or the bus has to keep moving. In such case, I think fuel cell plays a very vital role. If you want to move from carbon fuel to hydrogen-based fuel cells. But there again, we need to generate green hydrogen because right now the hydrogen again cannot come from gray and blue and all that. So we need to look at how to generate hydrogen green. I'm sure it will go the same way like power generation. It is a very good solution we need to look at for long haulage trucks and buses.
Okay. I want to come to the last question. In thus far, all the panelists have been cloyingly agreeable with each other. So I have to find some way to create some excitement in this panel. So there is always this global debate, are the disruptors going to wipe the legacy players off the slate in the EV business? Is Tesla going to, with its market cap, make Ford obsolete? Or will the legacy players fight back, as I mentioned, with the Ford F-150 coming in at a very attractive price and leverage their supply chain, their manufacturing skills, and so on? So I'd like to get your views on how this will play out in India, particularly the transformation of the landscape of industry. So Mahesh, I'll let you fire the first salvo.
Okay, I see this way. I think what we have done in the past is going to be only a passport. It's not going to be a guarantee of what is we are going to win in the future. It applies to legacy players. It applies to startup. I think this applies to every stage of metamorphosis the organization or the business is going through. I think the best people or the organization which will survive are the one who are agile, flexible, and meeting the consumer needs at that point and innovating constantly to address the customer needs of the future. So whether it is going to be a legacy player, whether it is going to be a startup who is going to address that consumer needs ahead is going to the one who is going to survive.
Arun, your take.
So, what Mahesh said, that would be true if every legacy player was basically a customer-focused organization, right? And since that's not generally true, I think the EV transition, I think most legacy players are still wrongly estimating what is really under the hood. I think, at least my conversations, most legacy players still continue to see the EV transition as essentially a technology change. Basically a glorified version of BS4 to BS6, right? But that's pretty much it, right? Like what's kind of missed out is that where value is going to sit in this new world is actually looking by every passing day quite different. And that's going to change the style of working. That's going to change business models, and that the entire value chain is basically changing. And I think that's something that most incumbents will struggle with. A technology change, a legacy player can cope up with. A price change, people can keep up with. Government policy change, people can keep up with. But the fundamental thing that creates value, that changes, right? And if you are caught with at the wrong point in the value chain, right, I think that can destroy a lot of businesses. So I think the key question to ask is how many of the legacy players are at the right place and in the new world where EV is taking them. I know I'm sort of speaking very for a high level, but I think depending on segment, it's very different, and depending on players, very different. So long story short, I don't think every legacy player makes this transition. And it's not about the fact that, oh, you are an old player, hence you will die. I think it's just about that, listen, like values change. If the old world meant values sat in who controlled production, or let's say who controlled distribution, like everybody with the biggest distribution used to win. The value is no longer sitting in distribution. The value is probably actually sitting very awkwardly in production and production capability with the new tech that a lot of players may not have the ability to transition to. So I think that's the key question to ask. And a lot of old players hence will not make the transition. In fact, arguably, a lot of new players also are making the wrong business model play. A lot of new startups will make the wrong bet on what it means to go into EV, and hence they will also die.
So Velan, before I come to you, I have to verbally describe a cartoon from the Hindu. There is this person anxiously waiting outside in the ante room of a VC fund manager, and the secretary peeps inside her boss's door and says, "Yeah, your visitor is here. He says he's from a startup, but I think he looks very experienced." So there is this feeling that if you're a startup, you should be inexperienced and naive. And you get downgraded if you look experienced. So you come from a group that is obviously very experienced, but you would like to play as a startup. So your take on this so-called dynamic.
Velan, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. No, I definitely think that if you look at it, historically across businesses, disruptions tend to favor. I mean, attackers are usually kind of favored in most disruptions, right? And so you're seeing that. You talked about Tesla's market cap. You're seeing it with kind of most other Rivian you talked about, right? And kind of it's amazing that Amazon has committed 100,000 vehicles to Rivian without even seeing one, right? And what I'm saying is, I think that what history teaches us is that disruptors are going to be at a position of advantage. I think that's going to be even more reinforced by the amount of funding coming in to startups in this space, right? Because like Mahesh said, the way most incumbents are looking at it is, let me take it as a separate decision and let me fund it, right? But that's very different from somebody that's going out and raising like literally like 3,000, 4,000 crores, right, to kind of come in and attack this space, right? And I think that those two characteristics definitely do favor the attacker as a result.
No, wonderful. I think I can see Vanitha has popped up indicating that it's about time for us to start to wind up. I must only conclude by saying that we couldn't have asked more from this panel. Very frank, very informed views of this industry, and it's been a delight. I didn't give Mahesh the chance to return the salvo from Tarun, but that will wait for another day. And let me only say thank you to all the panelists. It was wonderful, and I enjoyed being a part of this. Thank you. Over to you, Vanitha or Rahul.
Yeah. So on behalf of the CIC, I want to thank Dr. Sumantran, Vellayan, Mahesh, and Tarun. It was a fantastic talk. I think it gave us great insights from the point of view of the customer, what he expects, supply chain, policy, and industry structure. So I think it's a fascinating space to be in, and wish all of you all the best, and look forward to see how things pan out. Right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.